There are nights when I sit alone on the porch, staring at the wooden boards worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and I feel the weight of 42 years pressing down on my chest. It is in these moments, when the silence of the house becomes unbearable, that my mind drifts back to the beginning. I was only 20 for then, a young woman in a faded green dress and worn shoes, carrying the burden of a sick mother and endless work. Life was hard, yes, but it was never empty, because that was when Ernest walked into it. I still remember that morning as if it were yesterday. The air smelled of dust and summer, and I was walking toward the market, head down, counting the few coins in my pocket. Then he stepped out of his little bicycle repair shop, his hands black with grease, his face half hidden by the shy smile of a man who had nothing but was willing to give everything. "Good morning, Margot," he said softly, and in that gentle voice was a promise of all the years to come. I told him my bicycle needed fixing, though I didn't own one. It was just an excuse, a way to keep him talking. That small lie gave me the truth of a lifetime, love, real and unshakable. From that moment, we built a life together, though it was never easy. Our first house had a tin roof that leaked in every storm. I can still hear the clatter of raindrops on the pots we placed all around the floor to catch the water. Most people would have called it misery. We called it home. Ernest would work from sunrise to sunset, his hands raw from tools and metal, while I sewed clothes for the women in town to pay for medicine for my mother. We had little, but our laughter filled every corner of that house. When Charles was born, I thought my heart would burst with happiness. His eyes were so big, so full of life, the exact eyes of his father. Ernest held him as if he were holding the whole world. 2 years later, Henry came, soft and perfect, with my smile and his father's calm strength. I gave them every ounce of love I had. I went without new clothes, without proper meals, so they would never feel the hunger or shame that had followed me since childhood. Ernest taught them to fish, to fix things with their hands, to dream even when the world felt small. I taught them tenderness, patience, the warmth of a mother's embrace. Those years should have been enough to protect me forever, a shield against any future pain. But now, when I think back, the memories are knives. The sound of their childish laughter once lit up my world, now it haunts me, because I know where that laughter has led. The tiny hands that once reached for me in the night when bad dreams scared them are the same hands that signed papers to steal from us, that stirred poison into their father's coffee. It breaks me to remember how Ernest used to look at our boys. After long days at the shop, he would sit on the porch, Charles and Henry on his knees, and tell them stories about stars and faraway adventures. He wanted them to grow up knowing wonder, not just struggle. He never imagined that wonder would turn into ambition so sharp it would cut through the very family he had built. I often wake in the night and see him sitting there in my mind, staring at the sky with sadness in his eyes. I used to think he was only tired. Now I know he saw what I refused to see, that money was changing our sons, hollowing them out from the inside. When Charles first asked why we lived so modestly, I laughed it off. When Henry followed him, questioning why we had no car, I told myself it was normal, children dreaming of better lives. I never wanted to believe Ernest when he whispered, "Margot, money has changed our boys. We aren't enough for them anymore." I kept excusing their absences, their short phone calls, their brief visits. "They're busy," I said. "They'll come back to us." But love blinded me, and now that blindness is my curse. Because today, Ernest is in the ground, and my sons, my flesh and blood, stood by his coffin with cold, practiced tears. And I sit here with memories that burn like acid. Every Sunday fishing trip, every bedtime story, every meal eaten in our tiny kitchen, all of it feels poisoned now. The home that once echoed with laughter is silent, not because time has passed, but because betrayal has stripped it bare. If I close my eyes, I can still feel Ernest's hand in mine on our wedding day, still smell the starch of his only suit, still hear him whisper, "We will make it, Margot, no matter what." And we did make it. We made a life out of nothing, we made love out of struggle, we made joy out of rain dripping into rusty pots. But we could not make our sons stay true. We could not build their hearts the way we built everything else. That is the agony I cannot escape. It hurts most to think that Ernest died believing we had lost them long before we lost him. He was right. My memories, once treasures, have become tombstones. They remind me not of what I had, but of what I lost, what was stolen from me not by strangers, but by the very children I carried in my body, fed with my milk, raised with my hands. And so the past, my once bright past, has turned into the cruelest ghost. It is not just grief I feel. It is betrayal woven through every memory, every moment of love. And that betrayal cuts deeper than death itself. The morning of Ernest's accident began like any other, but memory has turned it into a black wound I can never close. I was in the kitchen, rolling out dough for his favorite lunch, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, when the phone rang. There was nothing unusual about the sound of the bell, but the voice on the other end tore through me like a blade. "Mrs. Hayes? This is Memorial Hospital. Your husband has been in a serious accident. You need to come immediately." The words blurred, melting together. Accident. Serious. Immediately. My hands turned numb, the phone slipped, and I had to grab the doorframe to keep from collapsing. Ernest, careful Ernest, who checked every screw, every bolt, who knew his shop like the lines on his palm, how could he be in an accident? My neighbor Doris had to drive me because I was shaking too badly to hold the keys. The entire ride, my mind screamed against itself, it's a mistake, a misunderstanding, maybe even a cruel joke. But deep down, my heart already knew the truth, something had broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. When we arrived, Charles and Henry were already at the hospital. I froze when I saw them because no one had called them, at least not me. How did they know? Why were they here before me, his wife of 42 years? But grief fogged my thoughts, and suspicion hid behind tears. Charles hugged me with a strength that seemed almost rehearsed. "Mom, Dad is in bad shape. The doctor said a machine exploded in the shop." Henry stood beside him, his eyes red but oddly dry, like a boy pretending to cry. His hand twitched at his side as though he wanted to check his watch. The nurse led me to the ICU, and that walk felt like crossing into another universe. My Ernest lay on the bed, wrapped in bandages, his face almost unrecognizable. Tubes ran from his arms, machines beeped with merciless rhythm, and his chest rose only because the ventilator forced it. My legs buckled. I grasped the edge of the bed, sobbing, "Ernest, my love, I'm here." For a moment, only a moment, his hand squeezed mine. His eyelids fluttered. My heart leapt with hope, but the nurse shook her head gently. "Involuntary reflex, ma'am. Don't read too much into it." But I knew my husband. That was no reflex. That was Ernest fighting, trying to tell me something. For 3 endless days, I lived in that hospital, refusing to leave even when Charles and Henry insisted I rest. They seemed more interested in paperwork, in insurance forms, in speaking privately with doctors, than in sitting by their father's side. I overheard fragments, words like policy, beneficiaries, cost of treatment. My blood ran cold. Why were they talking about money when their father's life was slipping away in the next room? On the 3rd day, Dr. Patterson, kind but weary, gathered us. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband's condition is critical. His burns are infected, and the head trauma is worse than we thought. We need to be realistic." I clutched my chest. "You mean he's going to die?" Silence. A nod. I screamed. 42 years, an entire life, reduced to a nod. "We'll try everything," I begged, "whatever it costs. Keep him alive." But Charles looked at Henry, and Henry nodded like a shadow. "Mom," Charles said softly, "Dad wouldn't want to live like this. He always said he never wanted to be a burden." A burden. The word cracked through me. Ernest was their father, the man who raised them, who bled for them. A burden? My sobs filled the room, but they did not move. Their faces were masks of practicality, of cold calculation. That night, alone with Ernest, I whispered, "Don't leave me. Please, Ernest. Please." Again, his fingers twitched against mine, and his lips tried to move. I leaned close, desperate to hear, but only silence answered. On the fifth morning, alarms shrieked. Nurses rushed in, shouting orders. I ran after them, but they blocked the door. No, no. I screamed, banging on the glass. For 40 minutes, they tried to bring him back. At 4:37 a.m., they stopped. The machines went silent. My world went silent. Ernest was gone. I threw myself across his still, warm body, sobbing until my throat burned raw. He was still my Ernest, but the life, the laugh, the light in his eyes, all of it was stolen, extinguished. An hour later, Charles and Henry arrived, unnaturally composed. They carried folders, business cards, funeral home brochures. "We already spoke to the funeral director," Charles said. "It'll be simple, as Dad would have wanted." Henry added, "The insurance claim is already underway." Insurance. Funeral arrangements. While I clung to my husband's body, still begging him to wake, my sons were planning money and caskets. Their words were knives. Their calmness was worse than cruelty. The funeral came quickly, too quickly. Only a handful of people stood at the graveside, Doris, a pastor, and my children with their stiff suits and cold eyes. Ernest had lived 70 years in Spring Creek, helped everyone with their bicycles, shared countless evenings on the porch with neighbors. Why was his funeral so empty? Why had Charles insisted on keeping it private? I wore my old black dress, the same one I had worn at my mother's funeral, my hands trembling too much for Doris to button it. When the pastor spoke of eternal rest, I wanted to scream. Ernest did not deserve rest, he deserved justice. As the first clump of dirt hit the coffin, my knees gave way. And that was when it happened. My phone vibrated in my purse. A message from an unknown number. "I'm alive." That's not me in the casket. The world froze. The letters danced in front of my eyes. My fingers shook as I typed back, "Who are you?" The reply came instantly, "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." My phone slipped from my hands as if it were on fire. My sons. My flesh and blood. Standing only steps away, their expressions curiously calm, their tears as false as glass. That was the moment my grief turned to terror. Ernest was gone, or was he? And my children, the boys I had loved with every breath, suddenly looked like strangers, shadows in suits, hiding something monstrous. That day, by my husband's grave, my world shattered for the second time. The days after Ernest's funeral were a blur of shadows and whispers. My house, once alive with his laughter and the steady rhythm of his footsteps, became unbearable in its silence. Every corner smelled of him, his coffee cup still on the table, his jacket draped over the chair, his tools lined neatly on the porch. Yet the phone in my purse burned like a curse, replaying that message again and again, "I'm alive. Don't trust our sons." I tried to convince myself it was a cruel joke, the work of someone with twisted humor. But then came the details, too precise to be coincidence. Check the bank account. Look at the withdrawals. The messages came late at night, when the house creaked like it was mourning with me. Each one made my hands shake harder, each one carved a deeper hole in my heart. I went to the bank the next morning, my legs trembling so badly Doris had to come with me. Mrs. Thompson, the manager who had known Ernest for 30 years, greeted me with her kind eyes and quiet condolences. "He was a good man, Margot. Everyone respected him." "I need to see the statements," I whispered, ashamed that suspicion had replaced grief. What I found nearly stopped my heart. Over the past 3 months, large withdrawals had been made, $1,000, then $3,000, then $4,000, money I never knew had left our account. "Who signed for these?" I demanded. Mrs. Thompson slid the papers across the desk. The signature looked like Ernest's, but it wasn't right. His hand had always been steady, precise. This was shaky, forced, as if someone had tried to copy him. "Did he come alone?" I asked, my voice cracking. Mrs. Thompson hesitated. "Now that you mention it, no. Once or twice he came with Charles. Said he was helping his father because Ernest had trouble reading the fine print without his glasses. Glasses? Ernest never removed them. He could see every screw in his shop, every stitch in my sewing, every freckle on my face. He didn't need Charles to read for him. My chest tightened. Something was terribly wrong. That night, another message arrived. The insurance was their idea. They pushed him to increase it. Don't you see? I stumbled to Ernest's old desk, the one he kept in his shop. His papers were still locked in the metal box where he stored everything important. With trembling hands, I opened it. There it was, the life insurance policy. My breath caught in my throat. 6 months earlier, the coverage had been increased from $5,000 to $50,000. Why? Ernest had never spoken of it to me. Why now, after decades of modest insurance, had he suddenly agreed to such a leap? And then I found it, a note in Ernest's handwriting, dated 3 days before his death. Charles insists I need more insurance. He says it's for Margot. But something doesn't feel right. I don't trust his intentions. The tears blurred the words. My Ernest, my careful Ernest, had doubted them too. And I, blinded by love for my children, had ignored every warning. I searched further, my hands trembling so violently that the paper slipped to the floor. Another note, Henry brought me documents to sign. Says it's for modernizing the shop. Why the rush? I don't understand. They had been circling him, cornering him, pressuring him into papers and signatures, trapping him with their schemes. My stomach turned. Had they already planned it then? When I thought I couldn't take any more, an envelope slipped from the back of the drawer, sealed with my name. I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was Ernest's letter. My dearest Margot. If you are reading this, something has happened to me. I've noticed strange changes in Charles and Henry. They are too concerned with our money, with the insurance, with selling the house. Jasmine pushes them constantly. Yesterday, Charles told me I should be more careful. At my age, any accident could be fatal. I don't know why, but his words felt like a threat. If anything happens, don't trust anyone, not even our sons. I love you always. Ernest. The paper slipped from my hand. My husband had sensed his death. He had tried to warn me. That night, I cried until my body shook, until no tears remained. I thought of the babies I had carried, the boys I had nursed, the laughter in the yard, the dreams under the oak tree. How had they turned into this, into men capable of poisoning their own father for money? The next morning, Stephen Callahan knocked on my door. A tall man with gray hair and serious eyes, he held a folder under his arm. Mrs. Hayes, he said gently, I'm a private investigator. Ernest hired me 3 weeks ago. My heart stopped. What? Why? Because he suspected Charles and Henry. He asked me to watch them. He opened the folder and laid out photographs, Charles walking out of a hardware store, a small brown bottle in his hand. The date stamped 5 days before Ernest's death. Receipts for methanol. Audio transcripts. Conversations about money, debts, insurance. I couldn't breathe. The room spun. No, I whispered, but the evidence screamed the truth. Ernest hadn't died in an accident. He had been poisoned, deliberately, by the sons we had loved more than life itself. And then Stephen's voice, low and steady, Mrs. Hayes, I need you to understand. They weren't finished. They planned to kill you, too. To make it look like suicide. The floor gave way beneath me. My grief turned to horror, my horror to rage. My sons had murdered their father, and now they wanted me dead as well. That night, staring at the empty chair where Ernest used to sit, I whispered into the darkness, I will not let them win. I will not let your death be for nothing. For the first time since the funeral, my tears dried. In their place burned something fiercer, sharper, the determination to uncover every lie, to drag every hidden truth into the light. Even if it destroyed me. The evidence began to stack like bricks in a wall too high for denial. Every paper, every photograph, every whispered warning Ernest had left behind led to one conclusion: my sons, my flesh and blood, had murdered their father. And worse, they had plotted to rid themselves of me too. Stephen urged me to remain calm. "We need the final piece," he said, his tone sharp, professional, but touched with a softness that made me feel less alone. "We can't just accuse them. We need something undeniable." So we waited. It didn't take long. Greed has a way of pushing men to reveal themselves. One night, as the clock struck midnight, Stephen handed me a small black device, a recorder. "We plant this in the study. Let them speak in their own words." I hesitated. "If they find it." "They won't," Stephen assured. "They're too confident. Too sure of themselves." And he was right. 2 nights later, Charles and Henry returned to the house under the pretense of helping me sort through father's things. I stood at the window, my heart thundering, as they went into the study, unaware of the recorder hidden among Ernest's old ledgers. Their voices carried through the thin walls. Henry's tone was sharp, impatient. "We need to move faster. That old woman isn't going to sign the documents willingly." Charles laughed, low and cold. "She doesn't have to. We already forged father's signature. We can forge hers. Just one accident, Henry, and she's out of the way." My knees buckled. Accident. That word again. It was how they had spoken to Ernest, how they had prepared his death. Now it was meant for me. The recorder caught it all, their laughter, their plans, even the mention of methanol. "Worked well enough on him, didn't it?" Charles sneered. Tears burned my eyes, but this time they weren't from sorrow. They were from rage so sharp it cut through the fog of grief. I pressed my hand against the wall, whispering to Ernest's memory, "I have it now, my love. The proof they can never erase." When the brothers left, Stephen was waiting in his car down the street. I climbed in, clutching the recorder like a lifeline. "Listen," I whispered, and pressed play. In the silence of the night, their voices filled the small car, mocking, cruel, dripping with betrayal. When the recording ended, Stephen's jaw was tight. "This is it. With this, we can go to the police." But fate had one more cruel twist waiting. The next morning, I discovered something hidden in Ernest's old valise, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed papers. My breath caught. It was a draft contract, my signature at the bottom, but shaky, distorted, not mine. A forgery. A document transferring ownership of the house and the bakery to Charles and Henry. "They were ready," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Even before Ernest died, they were preparing to erase me." Stephen examined it, his brow furrowed. "This isn't just fraud. It's premeditation. They meant to take everything, from your home to your livelihood." The weight of the betrayal crushed me. My sons, the boys I had once carried in my arms, had plotted not only to kill us but to strip away the very legacy Ernest and I had built together. The bakery, our life's work, reduced to a pawn in their scheme. I couldn't breathe. I clutched the contract against my chest and sank into Ernest's old chair, the wood groaning under the weight of my grief. For hours, I sat there, rocking back and forth, whispering his name. "Why, Ernest? Why did our sons turn into monsters?" But grief soon gave way to something harder, something steadier. Resolve. The following evening, Stephen and I went to the sheriff's office. My hand shook as I laid the evidence on his desk, the photos, the bank statements, Ernest's notes, the forged contract, and finally, the recorder. Sheriff Dawson listened in silence, his weathered face unreadable. But when the recording ended, his eyes darkened. "I knew those boys were trouble," he muttered, slamming his fist against the desk. "But this is murder." That night, Spring Creek didn't sleep. Patrol cars surrounded my home as officers stormed in to arrest Charles and Henry. I watched from the shadows, my heart torn in two. Charles shouted, his voice laced with fury. "Mother! How could you do this to us?" I met his eyes, my face pale but firm. No, Charles. How could you do this to us? To your father. To me. Henry tried to run, but an officer pinned him to the ground. As they dragged him away, something fell from his coat pocket, a small leather notebook. Inside were debts, names, and calculations. And scrawled across the final page in his uneven hand, "If she won't sign, we'll put her away." A widow's madness is believable. My stomach twisted. They had planned everything, right down to sending me to an asylum, silencing me forever. As the patrol cars carried them off, the night was thick with silence. The neighbors stood at their windows, faces pale in the moonlight, watching the Hayes family collapse in disgrace. I returned to the empty house, the echoes of Ernest's voice in my ears. For the first time in weeks, I lit a candle at his workbench and whispered, "We did it, my love. They won't hurt anyone again." The flame flickered, fragile yet steady, like the remnants of my heart. I had uncovered the truth, but the price was unbearable. My sons were gone to me forever, not by death, but by their own cruelty. And as I sat in the silence of that house, I realized the cruelest truth of all: sometimes justice doesn't heal. Sometimes it only carves the wound deeper. The trial felt like walking through fire. Each day in that courtroom tore open wounds I thought had already scarred. The recordings, the forged documents, the poison reports, laid bare before strangers and a jury that gasped with horror at every revelation. I sat straight-backed, dressed in black, Ernest's wedding ring hanging on a chain around my neck. I was not just a widow. I was his voice. When the judge read the verdict, guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, the words struck like thunder. Charles collapsed in his chair, his head buried in his hands. Henry stared at me with glassy eyes, as if I had betrayed him, not the other way around. The gavel came down, sentencing them to life in prison. A roar of whispers filled the courtroom, but inside me, there was silence. 4 months after, that silence haunted me. At night, I woke to hear echoes of their childhood laughter, then their adult voices plotting Ernest's death. The 2 boys I raised had died long before the trial. The men in prison were strangers who shared my blood but not my heart. And yet, justice had been served. Ernest's name was cleared. He had not died in a clumsy accident. He had been murdered by greed, and the world now knew the truth. That truth gave me something precious: peace. I withdrew from the noise of the world and poured my energy into the small bakery Ernest and I had once dreamed of opening. With Stephen's encouragement, I sold the shop where Ernest had been poisoned and bought a modest corner store. I named it Phoenix Bakery, a symbol of rebirth rising from the ashes of tragedy. Each morning, I woke before dawn, kneading dough with hands that had once rocked babies, hands that had buried a husband, hands that had fought for justice. The scent of fresh bread filled the street, drawing neighbors and strangers alike. For the first time in years, my house felt alive again, not a tomb of memories but a place of warmth. But the greatest rebirth wasn't the bakery. It was me. I began attending church again, not because I needed salvation, but because I needed community. Doris, my faithful friend, sat beside me every Sunday. Stephen, the investigator who had become more than a colleague, visited often. We shared coffee on the porch, laughter where there had once been tears. Slowly, the weight on my chest loosened. Still, grief has strange habits. Sometimes, when I watered the roses in my garden, roses Ernest had once planted, I whispered to the soil, "Do you see me, love? Do you see how I'm living, for both of us?" The wind through the leaves felt like his answer. Years passed, and the Phoenix Bakery became more than a shop. It became a haven. I hired young women from broken homes, young men who needed second chances. I told them, blood doesn't make family. Love does. Loyalty does. Respect does. Many of them called me Grandma Margot, and in their voices, I found echoes of the family I had lost. On the 5th anniversary of Ernest's death, I stood at his grave with a basket of fresh bread and sunflowers, his favorite. The inscription on his headstone read, "Beloved husband. Betrayed father. Honorable man." I touched the cool stone and whispered, "We won, Ernest. Not just in court, but in life. They tried to destroy us, but we built something stronger. I kept my promise." Behind me, the bakery girls and boys stood quietly, holding flowers. Stephen placed his hand on my shoulder. In that moment, I realized something profound. Tragedy had taken my sons, but life had given me a new family. Not by blood, but by choice. Justice had been painful, but it freed me. Love had been shattered, but it taught me resilience. And freedom came not from forgetting, but from transforming pain into purpose. As I walked home that evening, the sun setting in gold across Spring Creek, I knew Ernest was with me, not in body, but in every loaf I baked, every young life I lifted, every act of courage I embraced. The past had scarred me. But the future, at last, belonged to me.